Well, good morning, church. Welcome back to eService. I've changed a couple of things this week that I hope will make it a little easier for you to follow along. I've made the Bible text bigger, and I'm not going to jump around so much. And so I apologize for this format. I know it is not as good as what we've been doing for eService, and I know that you'll be happy to get back to normal, and so will I, but we're just making the best of it, best that we can. So according to the CDC, you need to wait 10 days from the onset of symptoms, and you need to be 24 hours symptom-free before you can get out of quarantine. And I meet those parameters now, but we're going to wait until this Wednesday before we resume services. So this Wednesday, which will be January 6th, we'll do our first Wednesday night Bible study again. And then we'll be back in person next week on January 10th. And eService will still be available. It'll be more like the normal eService where I'm actually preaching. But this week we're going to do another Bible study, and we're going to look at Psalm chapter 3. We looked at Psalm chapter 2 last week. We'll look at Psalm chapter 3 this week. So I'm going to share my Bible software screen with you again, and hopefully the text is much bigger this week and you can see it a little bit better. So we're looking at Psalm chapter 3, and we're going to walk through this. It's in 3 stanzas, and so it begins, Psalm 3, the Lord helps his troubled people. And the first thing that we see is that this is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So this is the context for how the psalm is coming to us. And so Absalom, I won't tell you the whole story, but this is from 2 Samuel 15. Absalom has killed his brother and then had to flee from David because Absalom, David's son, killed another one of David's sons. And so he's gone for a while, and finally he comes back, and it seems like maybe they might even be reconciled there for a little while. But Absalom does this underhanded thing. He begins to sit at the city gate. And anytime David judges against someone, and as they leave, Absalom says, well, it's too bad I'm not king, because I would have voted for you on that one. And he begins to undermine David in all these different ways. And finally, he decides to mount the rebellion. And on a specific day, at a specific time, he declares that he's the king, and David actually has to flee. And so Absalom has all the backing of the people. And as David flees in 2 Samuel 15, and you can see here it's verses 13 through 17, the name Saul keeps coming up time and time and time again. As David goes, first you have Mephibosheth's servant that comes and says, he thinks that this is the time that God's going to restore the kingdom to the lineage of Saul. And then there's this other character that comes, and he's walking along with David, cursing him, yelling at him, kicking up dust. And he says, this is all happening as revenge because of everything that you did to the family of Saul. Keeps coming up time and time again. And you get this picture that's being painted that what's happening with Absalom is so similar to what was happening with Saul, where the people picked the king not because he was the anointed of God, but because they thought he'd be a good king. And we have these verses in 2 Samuel 14:25. It says that, speaking of Absalom, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. It sounds so much like the way that the people picked Saul. It also speaks of Absalom. He cuts his hair once a year. And when the hair falls off, they weigh it, and they're just in awe of how much hair he can grow. It's hilarious. It's something like more than 3 pounds of hair he cuts off his head every year. And it's just, those are his qualifications for being king. He's good looking. He's handsome. It seems like he's a successful guy. He seems powerful. So they pick him as king, but he is not God's anointed. And so what we have in 2 Samuel 25:12, it says the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. Now that's leading up to the rebellion. And this is exactly how Psalm 3 begins, as David is writing about this time when he fled Jerusalem. He fled from Absalom. The whole world was against him. And he reads in this first stanza, 1 and 2, Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. And so we see many, right? Many are those who rise up against me is something that I'd like to highlight for us. Many are those who say there is no help for him in God. And by many, it is many. David goes on to say down here in verse 6, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people. And in reality, that's probably what David is facing. It's like the entire nation has turned against him. And so this psalm is separated really neatly into 3 stanzas. You have this first stanza, verses 1 through 2, and then the word Selah. And then we have the second stanza, verses 3 and 4, and then the word Selah. And then the last stanza, verses 5 through 8, and then the word Selah. That word is in here 3 times, and obviously it separates the psalm into three very obvious sections, but what does the word mean? Lots of people have suggested lots of different things over the years. It might be a musical term. It might be sort of a meditative term. I don't know about the musical term. It's interesting to me. It can't be a crescendo or a tempo increase, I wouldn't think, because it would be odd for the psalm to end with that word. It might be a meditative word, but it's strange that it only comes up in musical settings. So we don't really know what it means, but it is a breaker. And so that's the way we'll treat this psalm as three different sections. And in the first section here, verses 1 and 2, David is without a doubt outlining these people who have risen up against him and increased. And they haven't just increased, they're increasing every day. It seems that most of Israel is against David at this point, and he is having to flee literally for his life. And they say to him, there's no help for him in God. And we can stop here and say, this is how these people think about themselves. David's enemies consider themselves more powerful than God, that they are able to block God's aid to David, that they are able to say this thing, that there is no help for him in God, that they're more powerful than God. And their actions say as much. They have gone against God's anointed king, and they're in direct disobedience to God. So how does David respond to this overwhelming pressure, to this thing that should be bothering him to his very core? He should be living in fear. He should be struggling to eat. He should be struggling to sleep, all of these things. This is how David responds in the second stanza, verses 3 and 4. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. So David says, but you, O Lord, you are these three things to me. You are I can't highlight that. You are a shield for me. He says, you are my glory, and also that you are the one who lifts up my head. And I'll highlight that as well. And why don't we take these in reverse order? So first, the one who lifts up my head. David is saying about God that although Israel has rejected David, and David said, you're not our king. And as he leaves town, there's this man who's following him and cursing him loudly. And David probably feels like he's failed as king. The question is, how does God think about David? And we can picture here a child who comes to their parent and they come beaten down and feeling like a failure and ashamed of themselves, and their head is hung down low, right? And what does a good, loving parent do? They lift that child's head, right? They look them in the eye. They reaffirm their sonship or their daughtership, right? They tell them that it's going to be okay because they are going to take care of everything. That's exactly what God does with David. There isn't any of us who come to God with our heads held high. We all come as weak. We all come as needy. We all come hoping that God will accept us, and God lifts our heads. And so David couches his hope in God as God being the one who lifts his head. But then also David says, you, our Lord, are my glory as well. And glory, David's glory isn't found in the throne. His glory isn't found in the fact that he is king. His glory isn't found in the military, that he's this powerful man. David says his glory is found in that relationship with this God that lifts his head. David's glory is that he is a child of God. And so nowhere in the story in 2 Samuel is David saying, like, you better watch out because you're messing with King David. To the contrary, David is doing the exact opposite thing. When this man comes and he's cursing David and he's kicking up the dust, everybody says, you want us to kill him? And David says, no, God will take care of it. It could be that God will even bless me for this adversity. David, just like he was with Saul, he's completely trusting that God is just going to take care of it all. David's been obedient to God, and now God will do whatever God thinks is best. And David does end up receiving a kind of glory and vindication in this as well. And it's that it's clear that it's God's strength, it's God's wisdom, it's God's deliverance, but it's demonstrated through the life of David. So like the moon reflects the sun, right? David reflects the glory of God. And we should want that kind of glory in our lives, not self-seeking, prideful glory, but God's glory to be reflected through us in the way that we live and in the happenings of our life. We should long for the world to see those things reflected in us that are reflected in David. But David doesn't just say, you're the one who lifts up my head and you're my glory, but Lord, you are a shield for me. And I love to highlight this verse here. The word for here is literally around. It's actually the same word ba'ad that's used for fencing. So I can show you that word here. And David is basically saying, not just for me, Lord, but you're about me, you're around me, right? Nothing can get to David because he serves a God who is omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent. God is with David even right now in his struggle, right? Just like God is with Mary and Joseph as they fled, just like God was with the Israelites as they fled, just like God has been with his people time and time again. And God knows what's happening. He's omniscient and he is omnipotent. He's more powerful than David's enemies, and David knows this, and so he calls God the shield that's around him. And we can think of an instance like Elisha when the king of Syria attacks and the whole city's surrounded, and Elisha's servant comes to him. He says, what are we going to do? They completely have us surrounded. And Elisha says, there's more with us than with them. And he prays that God would open the eyes of his servant. And he begins to look around and see all these horses and flaming chariots. The Lord is a shield and he's the deliverance. And so this is what David says of God, that you're a shield, you're my glory, you're the one who lifts my head. So he says, I cried to the Lord with my voice. He's praying out loud and God heard me, he says, which is exactly what we should be doing in our distress and in our adversity when people are rising up against us and we're tempted to think that there's no help for us. We look to God, our shield, our glory, the one who lifts up our head, and we cry out to him with a loud voice, and God will hear us. So then we go into this last stanza. What does David do in light of everything that's happening against him and in light of who God is that's with him? David does something that is so incredibly incredible, right? The truth that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent allows David to do something miraculous here. David's deposed of the throne. His own murderous son is chasing after him, and he's on the run. He's legitimately fearing his own safety and the safety of all of his loved ones that are with him, and the safety of his son, who he still loves, even though he's attacking him, but not just fearful for his own safety, but for the safety of his entire kingdom that he's responsible for. And what does he do? It says he lays down and slept. I lay down and slept. I don't know if you have ever struggled to sleep when something is deeply bothering you, but this is miraculous that David is able to sleep. And why is he able to do that? And the answer comes, for the Lord sustained me. I truly think that this is incredible. Like I said, sometimes we find it very difficult to sleep when there's things that are bothering us. So the question is how? Well, the Lord sustained David, right? We begin to understand that. But really, what is the best sleeping medication on the planet? It is what David, it's the truth that David's been meditating on up to this point. That one, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Two, that same God, that omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God is the one who lifts our head and is our glory and is a shield about us. And then thirdly, God may not do what you'd wish him to do right now, but God is always going to work for his glory and for your good. He reflects his glory through your life, child of God. And so even though God may not do what you want him to do right now, he will always do what's best, and you can trust him. So the 3 O's, that same God is for you and you can trust him, allows David to sleep. And we see that these people have, these tens of thousands of people have set themselves all around David. But as he's surrounded by his enemies and these people have set all around him, remember that God is a shield around David. And although these people are saying there's no help for him in God, and they have risen up against him in verse 1, the people have risen up against David, but look who's going to rise up as well in verse 7. Arise, O Lord. God himself has risen up in defense of David. So David is surrounded by his enemies, but he's surrounded by his God who is greater. And his enemies have risen up, but his God has risen up, who is even greater. And verses 7 through 8 are all about God's deliverance. Let's read these together. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. And this language, striking him on the cheekbone and breaking the teeth, I really believe is deliverance kind of language. David writes in Psalm 58, break their teeth in their mouth, O God, break the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Well, why do you do that? It's not just revenge, it's not just attack, it's to deliver the prey. It's deliverance, right? Job writes the same kind of thing in 29:17. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. That's what God is doing for David here. He is delivering David in this situation. And that is exactly why David says in verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. Salvation language comes in because that's exactly what God is doing. He's delivering, he's saving. This is what the people said in verse 2, that there's no help for him. Literally, there's no deliverance. There's no deliverance for him in God. And what David says in retaliation, verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people, and it's God's people that he is going to save. The word here for salvation, as a side note, is Yeshua, which is Jesus, right? And how important is that to us? But that's a sermon for another time. As we look at verse 7 and 8, David knows that he's anointed king. He knows that he can ask for God's deliverance here because he isn't just asking that God would vindicate David, but for God's own plan to move forward. And this theme of just resting in God's plan and resting in who God is so prominent, right, in the Bible. But you can think of some examples in the New Testament when the disciples are on the storm of the Sea of Galilee, and that storm has completely surrounded them in their little boat. What's Jesus doing? He's sleeping, right? And his response to them probably shook them. He says, why were you so afraid? Well, takes a disciple like Peter, who knows the ocean, and probably on the outset, he was able to look out and maybe see that a storm was coming, although it came up quickly. And he's probably thinking, as the storm comes up, why didn't I go against my better judgment? But he learns this lesson of patience and trust in Jesus. And it's interesting to look later down the road in Peter's life, when he's arrested for preaching the gospel, and he's laying in that prison cell, and he's wondering what's going to happen the next day. Are they going to bring him out and make an example of him? And he prays for God's deliverance, and God delivers mightily because salvation belongs to the Lord and your blessing is upon your people. But when the angel comes to deliver Peter from prison, the angel, it says in the book of Acts, has to shake him awake. He was sleeping, even though he was likely to be killed or punished the next day. He had told the Lord the situation. He trusted him with it. Now, how can we rest like that in the face of our own adversity, right? I believe it's with these three truths. The first one, that God is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. He's always with us. He's always wiser than us, and he's always working for his glory and for our good, and always more powerful than our situation and any of our enemies. And that same God, too, is the one who isn't just huge and big, but he's the one that lifts our head, that is our glory, and is a shield around us. And then thirdly, that God may not do what he'd wish he would do right now, but he will always do what is best, and that you can trust him. Those are amazing truths for us to glory in. I would challenge you, if you're not already set on reading something this week, read Psalm 3, read 2 Samuel 15, read about Absalom and David, and hear David's heart cry in Psalm chapter 3. These are really powerful words coming to us in Scripture. I will see you hopefully Wednesday night. God bless.